Hello and welcome to another episode of Cosmic Echo, a tailored podcast. This podcast explores a strange and bizarre phenomenon that happens in our lives when we sleep in altered states. In this episode, I speak with Jörg Starkmuth, who is the author of The Making of Reality: How Consciousness Creates the World. Jörg discusses his views on consciousness and how consciousness creates what we perceive as reality, as well as how this affects our daily lives and our so-called fate. Well, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Jörg, it's very nice to have you with me today, and it's been a while since we've started talking about consciousness and reality and stuff like that through the Tail Leaders group, and really just want to get into your book here and learn more about your views on reality and consciousness, and explore this book together as we go through. And can you give us a little bit of a background of who you are and how you got interested in learning about consciousness and reality and what that means to you?
Okay. Well, first of all, hi everybody, and forgive my English. It's I'm a lot better in written English than in spoken English. I think I'm not just so. I don't get much practice in that. I love writing. I'm a writer by birth, I think. So I always loved writing. As a child already, I started writing at the age of 5.
Oh, wow.
And that's one thing. The other thing that is a background of my book is my, well, let me tell you, I'm an engineer. I actually studied electrical engineering, and I never practiced that job, but in my mind, I'm an engineer, I would say. I want to see, I want to learn how things work. I want to understand how they work, and I want to develop things further, and I want to make things perfect. And that contributed to the book. And as a teenager, I started to get fascinated by phenomena like out-of-body experiences and ghosts and UFOs, and you can imagine everything you can find in books, a lot of nonsense, of course, and it really surprised me how much there is besides that what established science tells us. So I was really fascinated, but on the other hand, I was a very rational person, and I still am. And I was wondering, how could I reconcile all these new things and phenomena with what science tells us? And I don't want to believe in two different worldviews. I wanted to have one. So a consistent worldview. That was something I always was striving for. And so I started to read and think, and actually, there was one fine day when I said, "Oh, now it's round to a degree that I could present it to other people to give them a shortcut for the way that I went. I'll write the book that I would have needed 10 years earlier."
Interesting.
So, and the other thing that contributed to the book was my personal history of suffering. Everyone suffers to some degree on this level of reality, at least.
Definitely.
Yes, I had a girlfriend who left me, and it was a huge pain, and I started to get therapies and sorts of, and I met people who were spiritually interested and introduced me to new ways of therapy and esoteric stuff and lots of nonsense again. And that was another thing I wanted to sort out, to say what is true and what is not, and what works and what does not, and how does it all fit together. And this is another important part of the book. One thing is physics and science and how does reality work. How does matter work? What is time? What is space? And the other thing is, what is the mind? What are emotions? What is consciousness? And how do they work together?
Interesting, man. Well, we've been talking about consciousness and reality for some time now online, and I know that your views are very interesting, and they correspond a lot to what I think as well. So I'm really interested in going into this book and learning more for readers or listeners.
By the way, you didn't mention the title of the book.
Oh, yeah. the making of reality, how consciousness creates the world. It's a very interesting book. And so going into the book and like the first section, you talk about how we create the world that we're experiencing. I'm interested to understand how you went about learning about that idea, and then how you go about kind of presenting the idea to the readers.
Could you specify that question?
Well,
so
I know the translations may be a little hard. How do you see humans perceiving the reality that they are experiencing through our senses, through neurology, and then how does that work inside the brain in order to create the reality experience that we have?
The role of the brain is an important question that we have discussed several times on Tail Eaters. It's from my point of view, and this is something that will be part of another book I'm currently writing. From my point of view, consciousness is the only thing that we can be sure about. The only thing that we just know it exists, because anything else could be an illusion, which brings up the next question: what is an illusion anyway? So actually what we perceive is of course reality, but the deeper nature of that reality actually remains hidden from us. So actually the only things we are sure about is consciousness on the one side and information that this consciousness is observing on the other side. Oh, just need to shut down my phone here.
No problem. Well, can you go more into about why that's true? Like why consciousness is the only real thing that we know for a fact?
So from our conventional point of view, all we perceive is information, at least in our daily lives. All we can perceive, what you can see and hear and taste it, is information that is processed by our senses and our brains. So actually, we don't see anything, we don't hear anything outside of us. We only perceive information in our brain. This is the first important thought. So all we see is actually inside of us. All we hear is actually inside of us. We cannot really know what is outside of us. We cannot even really know that there is outside. You see, the boundary between outside and inside is an arbitrary definition that we take. We say most people identify with their bodies. You know.
Yes.
They say where my skin is where my body ends, and that is where I end, and the rest of the world begins. But it's just arbitrary. You got an electric field around you. You got probably a lot more around you that people can see in an out-of-body experience, for example. Apparently, we do have lots of energy bodies, for example, and you got a cloud of chemical stuff around you. You got a gravitational field around you. You have so many things that extend. Some of them extend into an infinite space. There is no boundary between us and the rest of the world. We just define one. So.
That's
actually,
yeah, like
what we construct out there is our own representation of the information we perceive. It's actually a model of a world that we assume is out there. So the only thing that makes us believe that there is an outside world is that information comes in that surprises us. If we knew everything, that then we would probably perceive everything as ourselves. There would be no reason to assume an outside world. But if anything comes in that surprises me, then I think, oh, that can't be me. There must be something else out there. And then I construct a model in my mind that tells me how this outside world, this apparent outside world works. And then if you think one step further, all the information that we have about our body and our brain actually is just a model too. Everything we know about our brain is just information too that we read in books or we perceive in medical examinations, etc., etc. It's just a model, just like anything else we perceive. Even our brain is our attempt to explain the world. a world that consists of matter and such things as time and space. Everything is just our humble attempt to sort these things into a system that we can work with.
Well, I mean, okay, so you bring information from the outside into your senses, and that's kind of the experience that you're having of the outside experience that you're having internally, right? It's simulated inside the brain.
Yes, and there's one other aspect that I forgot to mention. Of course, the other thing that makes us assume that there is an outside world is the consistency between what we think about the world and what other people think about the world.
Yes, interesting.
So, actually, I cannot prove that you exist. You may be just a projection of myself, just like anything else. But I assume that you exist, just like me. That we are equal in this respect and equivalent. So. Of course, what I perceive of you is to a great degree my perception and my projection, but I assume that you as a consciousness exist outside of my individual consciousness. But this is the only thing I'm quite sure about. So, but if I assume that other people really exist and aren't just my own projections, then what these other people tell me about the world makes me assume that there is some world out there that is consistent for all of us, the world that science describes to us with its laws of nature and etc. It's a very reliable world, a reliable reality that we can calculate to a great degree. So this is the second aspect that makes us think there is an outside world, and it's a valid point, of course. But the deeper nature of this outside reality is still unknown. The only thing we know, if we assume that everyone exists, at least as a consciousness, an instance of consciousness, then there must be a joint source of information that reaches all of us. And this is perceived as the outside world. So this means there is a connection between us in the form of information that we all perceive or that we all jointly create. We cannot really say, we cannot be sure whether we perceive something that is already there or we create something by projecting it outside. So in case of a dream, for example, most people assume that we project it from our memories.
Right.
But in case of the outside world, we believe the opposite. We believe that it's there and it just is projected into us. But in both cases, we cannot be sure that it's the whole truth. So the outside world may have a lot of projection in it. Maybe it's completely projected, but in that case, it would probably be projected by all of us as a joint consciousness, a group consciousness. This is my model of consciousness. Is a fractal model. You know what a fractal is? It's something like a tree that starts with a trunk and then splits into branches and splits into twigs and leaves. And we are sort of the leaves on the tree. We believe that we are separate beings, but we are part of a system of consciousness. And every one of us has an individual consciousness and an individual reality. Everyone has fantasies and interpretations about the world that are very individual. But on the other hand, we have joint realities as a group, as a society, or as humanity as a whole. And I think these are just levels of consciousness, different layers of consciousness that are more or less individualized, but all connected, like the tree that I'm loving to use as a metaphor.
Yeah.
Yes, and as long as you think that you're a leaf and separate from everything else, it's a quite lonely life. But when you start to get a glimpse of the entire connection between everything, which I believe exists because people have experiences in a state of enlightenment, for example. You suddenly just know that everything is connected. I did not perceive that. I did not experience that myself, but I know people who did. And they all agree on this one thing. Everything is connected, and our individual consciousness is not so individual as it feels. It's just a glimpse of something much bigger that just creates the illusion of separation.
I mean, it logically makes sense, from what you told me, that you would come to the conclusion that everything is kind of connected in a way as well.
Yes, I actually wanted to make it logical for a rational person like me. There are so many people out there who want to expand their mind and their consciousness into something bigger, but their rational mind is actually an obstacle, because it tells them it cannot be. It's contradictory, but it's not. I try to eliminate all these apparent contradictions, and that's actually the purpose of the book I wrote. I wanted to build a bridge between all these points of view and all these experiences that people are having. And it's ongoing work. I'm still working on that, and still many unsolved questions that we have partially been discussing on Tail Eaters. But I think that book is a great first step for people like me who are really skeptical and rationally minded, but also open-minded, and really want to know how it all fits together.
Yeah, I want to expand on this, the idea of this connectiveness that we have with between all people. I mean, I know you're familiar with like the collective unconsciousness, and I'm wondering how that plays a role into this connectivity that people have in this reality and creating this reality. Is that similar to the same thing, or is it different?
You mean the collective unconscious that's described by Jung?
Correct. Yes.
Yes. I actually don't know so much about his theories, but I'm very sure that it's actually fits very well into my model, and into that fractal model. There's another metaphor I like to use. It's also in the book, that it's the metaphor of islands in the sea. If you have a group of islands in the ocean, they all seem separate because you have the water level that hides the rest. And the rest is actually a mountain range below the sea, which is entirely connected. But just the peaks of the mountain are protruding from the sea and appear like separate islands. And I think that we all have this connection underwater. So the question is only where you place the water level. Yeah, I think that some things like enlightenment or deep connections, even the deep emotional connections between people that sometimes occur, are actually just a change of the water level. If you lower the water level, more of the connection becomes visible, becomes apparent, and I think that the collective subconscious or the group consciousness of a group of people, or even all people together, or all beings in the universe, which are a lot more than humans. So I think everything is basically consciousness. Everything that exists, not just people and animals. Actually, everything. It's just to a different degree of individualization. I mean, humans are the most individualized beings that we know of. All animals live in collectives. They live in groups, and according to authors like Michael Rhodes, for example, they are very much connected to their group consciousness. He has had very interesting out-of-body experiences where he connected to the collective souls of certain animal species. And he found that when an animal dies, for example, it's not such a big thing as when a human being dies. They just know they return to their collective soul, and then they become an individual again, and it's just a natural thing for them. So it's not a bad thing to die. People are somewhat different. They are much more individualized, and they forgot completely about this deeper connection with everything, and they forgot about the principle of reincarnation, which is part of the game. For example, I assume that it's part of the game, because if you forget that you can be reborn, you have a greater fear of death, of course, and this makes many things in this life apparently much more important, which they aren't actually, because it doesn't matter. You can die as often as you want. You can live as often as you want. But if you believe that it's important to survive, important to achieve certain things in life, and so you become very creative, and also you create a lot of problems. a lot of self-made lessons you can learn in order to be a more loving, a more profound person. I would say. I think that it's a concept that we maybe created ourselves long before we were born as humans. I think that it's a sort of a game that we created to learn something and to create a new kind of being. And all this drama that we experience as humans is just somehow part of this game. It's a cruel game sometimes, but very effective, because it forces you, in a way, to be creative, to create things that would never be created if you already knew everything. Yeah, no one would fly to the moon if they knew that in an out of body experience you can easily fly to the moon without a rocket. But it's great. It's a great experience to build a rocket and fly to the moon. It's just a game. I see it that way, at least. And it's a huge for a human being. It's a huge achievement, and I find it great. Even now that I know it's actually completely unnecessary, I find it's a great achievement, a great adventure, and something like that can only be created in an illusion like our separated lives. But on the other hand, for the evolution of mankind, it's very important to find back to our roots, to find the way back to the bigger consciousness that we are all a part of. And I think we are just about now in this phase of transition to return with all the crazy stuff we created over centuries, and to forget about the bad stuff and to take all the good stuff with us, and all the stories and all the adventures we had as mankind as a whole. And I think it's just a very great wave of evolution that we are currently experiencing.
Interesting, man. Yeah, a lot of people I've talked to recently have been discussing the same thing as you, towards this change in maybe humanity and the evolution of humanity and awareness. I'm interested in understanding consciousness as itself. Like, how do you know that consciousness isn't another illusion, like that you kind of describe reality as being?
First, it's just an assumption. Of course, I cannot exclude the probability that it's just like science tells us, that consciousness is just a construct of the brain, just a product of the brain. But the fact that people, especially meditating people or people in an enlightened state, can perceive pure consciousness without any information in it, just consciousness, just being, without identifications. And you think about nothing, you perceive nothing, at least nothing central, nothing, no images, no sound, but still there is something remains, something very fundamental, something which is bare of any structure, but it still exists. And this is such a fundamental experience, according to all people I have read and heard about, that it makes me assume that this must be the foundation of everything, because it makes so much sense that creation goes from the unstructured source to the roots of the tree. The trunk of the tree, a very simple structure, and it's starting to split up into more and more differentiated realities. It just makes so much sense that it's extremely convincing for me. I cannot prove it. No one can prove it, but the overall picture of everything I wondered about and I read about and heard about, this model so far makes the most sense for me. I cannot say anything more about that.
That's fine, man. Well, it's great that those are great points as well. Consciousness exists, so therefore it's kind of it's the one truth that is the truth, that you have consciousness, you have awareness. So it's a great point, man. And how do you perceive this thing we call consciousness being created? How did it start? Where did it start from?
Actually, I could say I haven't been there, but I think I have been there, but not as myself, because I am a creation much further down the road. I as an individual. But from a logical point of view, it can only be created out of itself, because, well, what we are talking about is something that, in my opinion, cannot be described really in words and in logic, because words and logic and language are all based on the notion of separate things, separate objects, and a linear time, and nothing of that can be taken for granted. Many spiritually experienced people say that time is not linear, for example. So there actually isn't a certain point in the past where consciousness started to split up. Actually, you could say it's all happening right now, or it's not happening at all. It's just a static thing, which is just differentiated. In my book, I describe time as a dimension, just like the 3 dimensions of space, which, by the way, is quite close to what physics tells us. The 4-dimensional space-time of Einstein's relativity theory. If you consider that time as a dimension, then everything exists at the same time. Well, you see the problem. Mm-hmm. I cannot say at the same time, because it's a mental trap. Because if you put the Big Bang at one end of the story and the end of the universe at the other end, well, 10 meters right of it, then you get one big object that represents the entire history of the universe. And you could assume that it all exists simultaneously, and our notion of time is just the effect of our consciousness wandering along this great object and perceiving it slice by slice.
Interesting. Yeah, I know in your book you very well describe time and how your view of time is. But for the listeners, can you give us a quick rundown of your perception of time in this 4th dimension and how it operates?
Well, from a physical point of view, it's not that easy. Time is not a separate dimension. Actually, time and space, according to relativity theory, are deeply intertwined. Actually, there's just one 4-dimensional continuum that's perceived as space and time by ourselves at the same time. And depending on your speed, by the way, if you're close to the speed of light, your time and space axis of your personal coordinate system are completely different from those of someone who has zero velocity relative to some point. So space and time are not absolute things, which even from a conventional physical point of view, they are not really fixed. Mm. They are just our way to describe our own experience of events that takes place in this huge 4-dimensional space-time continuum. And even the order of events is not fixed. Yeah, an event somewhere in the universe can be perceived by one person, and in one point, if you have 2 events in 4-dimensional space-time, then some people or some beings on some planets would maybe perceive one of these events as the first one, and the other one as the second one, and on some other planet with some other velocity, it could be the other way around. So there's not even a strict differentiation between past and present and future. It's all a big continuum, and that's just physics. That's not spirituality. That's not esoterics. It's just physics. But it's consistent with spiritual experience. So actually, if we imagine a multidimensional space which consists of these 4 dimensions of physics, of space-time, and additional dimensions that represent different possibilities how the universe could evolve, then we have a huge possibility space that represents everything that could ever exist. And if we now imagine consciousness as a pure observer, a point of observation, just like a camera in a warehouse, for example, a surveillance camera. But it's movable. So, and then you move this camera, which is just an observer, a passive point of observation. You move it through this huge space of possibilities. Then this movement would create some sort of history, some sort of story, and that would be the origin of time. The way you sort events to create an evolving story would actually be the origin of time. So it's some sort of movement of consciousness. We are dealing with the absolute borders of the limits of language here and the limits of our logical mind. So it's really, really hard to explain this. And of course, I'm not sure whether I'm right.
In exploring consciousness and trying to understand the elements that go into consciousness, I'm really interested in understanding the different aspects of consciousness as well, such as like the unconscious and the subconscious.
Actually, I would say that, again, these are not fixed terms. First of all, subconscious or unconscious doesn't make such a big difference for me. There are things that are present in my consciousness right now, in my individual consciousness, and things that are not. But things that apparently exist anyway, because at least other people tell me they exist, and I have ways to approach them somehow. I think for me, what I just described as possibility space is actually a huge information matrix. It's a space full of information, and what we perceive as our individual consciousness, or the contents of our individual consciousness, is a sort of a perception bubble within this information space. You imagine a bubble in this space which is filled with light, and every information that is inside the bubble can be perceived consciously. And everything that's outside the bubble is what we call the unconscious. And if we now imagine that other people are in the same huge information matrix, their bubbles intersect with ours partially, but they also have their separate parts. And there are parts that are unconscious to all of us. And then when if we remember the fractal model of consciousness that I was talking about, with the islands in the ocean and the dropping water level, then this would mean that we can expand these bubbles. Yeah, you can produce some, you can create protrusions that or probes of your personal consciousness bubble. You can send out a tiny sub bubble that goes somewhere and retrieves some information and comes back to you. That would be something like remote viewing, for example, or precognition, or anything like that. If you are able to move parts of your consciousness through this huge information matrix, which is identical with the possibility space and space-time, then you could get a glimpse of the future, or at least one possible future, or the past, or information that is actually outside your senses, for example. In that case, in that moment, you would expand your consciousness, or you could expand your consciousness as a whole. For example, in an enlightened state, when you suddenly perceive everything as connected to you, then you would soften the borders of your bubble. It's a very flexible thing, actually. And actually, I think that everything is consciousness, but the part of it that we perceive as ourselves, as the individual, is such a flexible bubble that can be changed in size and changed in shape relative to this information matrix. It's just a model, of course, but I think the point is clear.
Yeah.
Anything that we are discussing on Tail Eaters is actually variants of such expansions of consciousness. And there is no fixed border between conscious and unconscious, for example. Even the classical unconscious things in just like your deep-rooted emotional patterns that give us so much trouble in our lives that you normally treat with psychotherapy and something like that. You can perceive it directly in an out-of-body experience or in a dream, for example. You can suddenly in some sorts of dreams you can see representations of your fears, for example, and in that case they suddenly are completely conscious. So your subconscious is not so subconscious if you know how to access it. You can really perceive it in a sensual manner, even though it's just your own personal projections, and the shape you give it, of course, is yours alone. That monster you are seeing does not exist outside your fantasy, but it's not just a fantasy, but it's a representation of something that you have carried with you all your life, some deep-rooted fears, for example, and you can deal with it. You can face that monster or start to love it, or first you probably would start to fight it, and you would find that it doesn't work. So try to love it.
Yeah.
And most people get a big surprise when they start to deal with these fears in a loving way. So there are lots of possibilities to expand and our consciousness and make use of these experiences to make a better life.
Jörg, from your perspective, how do you see words like love, hate, good, bad, being involved in this experience of consciousness?
I like everything, I see this as a multi-layer construct. So actually, on the layer of our normal logical mind, it's just words. It's just a shell. A word is just a shell. It's our attempt to put something that we experience into a box. A box that is labeled with a word, so we can talk about it and think about this, discuss it with others. That's an approach that makes sense to some degree, but we should be aware what we are doing. The world does not consist of objects. It consists of a continuum of experience, of possibilities. So if we use words to describe something, we always reduce it. It's not without reason that I'm addressing this issue in the first chapter of my book, because it's so important to know everything we discuss and everything we think about is models in our brains, which are using words and logical terms to sort the world into boxes. But it's just an auxiliary means. It's a horrible word, auxiliary.
So you're meaning that it's like what you're saying is like the words that we're using are actually like died down versions of kind of like what is really happening. It's a way, it's a symbol to represent something that's much deeper.
And notions like love is better than hate, they are true on one level, of course. What actually is the standard by which you measure good and bad? Actually, there is only one standard that is common to all people that we can measure it by. It's does it create pain? Then it's bad. Does it not create pain? Then it's good. Actually, this is the only standard that we can measure it by outside. If we try to drop any what's it called in English? Any philosophy, any different cultures, and all these cultural differences about what is good and bad or what is right and wrong. If you drop all those, the only thing that remains is our biology, is what we all have in common, and it tells us some things are painful and some things are not, and that's just mostly a product of our survival system, our physical survival system, which tells us that some things are bad for survival and some things are good. This is what good and bad are based on. They are not fundamental truths, in my opinion. Nothing that is defined by some god or something else. It's just a matter of living in a physical world and trying to survive there and trying to have a good life down here. But on a higher level, on the level that I described before, what is this game all about? It's about creating new experiences, creating a new wave of evolution. Then you could say that hate is not that bad, because it allows us to make certain experiences that in turn are good again. The greatest stories of mankind have to do with suffering and overcoming of suffering. to some degree, it seems to be necessary, at least at this stage of evolution. So nothing is bad by itself, but it's necessary for certain experiences. And of course, we are all trying to reduce the amount of suffering, and that's a good thing, I think. But I think without the experience of suffering that we have had for millennia, we wouldn't be what we are, and we wouldn't be such complex and differentiated beings. So it's all relative. I think all terms on all these layers of consciousness, they have different meanings, they have different significance, and you cannot judge anything. And if you try to judge anything, just keep in mind there are dozens of other layers where it could be different. Actually, that was one big thing that made me write this book at all. So back then, when I started to write the book, I was one of those people who were a lot into this law of attraction thing, which I still find is true to some degree, and the degree to which it is true, I am trying to describe in the book. Of course, it's not so easy. If you read a book like The Secret or something, then it all sounds very easy. You can have anything you want. You just need to wish for it in the right way. And actually, that's true. But there are two big questions: what is the right way? And the second question is, why do you want it at all? So in practical life, it's not that easy, and that was one big mission for writing this book, to explain to people why it's not that easy. Actually, we do create our own reality. In my worldview, of course, we are all embedded in a collective reality. No one of us can change the laws of nature for everybody. Maybe some people are able to change them for themselves. Maybe if Jesus was able to walk on the water, of course, maybe he was. It's possible. There are other people in history who were said to overcome gravity. It's possible, maybe, but not for everybody. You cannot change it for everybody. You can change a lot of things for yourself. So we still have this common frame of reality. But the part of reality that is truly yours, it's not just your interpretations of reality, which is the most important thing, but also your surroundings, the people you are with, the place where you live, maybe even the parents that you choose before you are born, maybe. That's your personal reality, or the part of reality that is yours. And this is the one that you can change to some degree, at least. And I'm trying to explain how this works and why it doesn't work for many people who just try to use principles like the law of attraction. Because, as I said, I think the law of attraction actually works, but what you attract depends a lot on your subconscious mind. So if you want to attract a really positive reality towards yourself, you either need to be a very positive person in the first place, or you need to take care of those negative patterns that are buried deep inside yourself. And most people can't do that from now to then, but you really need to work on it. And this is the point. So there are so many deep-rooted fears which are actually unnecessary, but they are a product of our survival system, which is a bit out of place today. We have such a safe society. Many of these patterns of behavior that are implanted in our brains for millions of years are no longer useful today. And there are lots of misunderstandings in our brains, and they are producing most of the problems that we experience. We actually don't have many problems. We don't have many real problems. Most problems are our own constructions and projections. So this is something I'm addressing in the book, how our instincts work and how they are fooling us into feeling that something is dangerous. Almost nothing that we ever experience is dangerous, for most people at least, that live in Germany or in the US or anything, in any civilized country. Of course you can be shot, or of course you can die by cancer or something, but most of the stuff that we experience doesn't threaten us at all. We just think that it does.
Right.
But when we get into fear, we are actually in a mode that was born for that was created for fight and flight by nature, but it's no use for us. So I'm trying to explain how we can overcome these patterns of behavior, these patterns of emotion. And that would be a good basis to then apply the law of attraction. In fact, you don't need to even apply it consciously anymore because it will just work.
Interesting.
You attract what your consciousness is focused on, but what your consciousness is focused on depends on these patterns. And so you need to clean up there. So if you think about money and about being rich, you think about what you could have done when you were younger. So it's a feeling of regret. It's a feeling of failure. And what do you get when your consciousness is focused on failure? Of course, you get failure, or at least something that feels like failure. So you actually this law of attraction. Actually, what it does is just confirming what we already believe. So if you unconsciously believe that you're a complete loser because you're not a millionaire, then thinking about money will always trigger that pattern that says you're a complete loser, and then this will never allow you to become a millionaire.
So it's like self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah, our entire reality is a self-fulfilling prophecy, I would say.
Interesting, man. That's a good approach. And I'm jiving with it. You've brought up quite a few times your focus on out-of-body experiences and dreams. How do those play a part in your research and your ultimate view of consciousness and reality?
Well, they are not so much covered in my first book. I've started to really dive into this later, but actually they substantiate my worldview because, in my opinion, there is enough evidence that shows me that the realities that people observe during an out-of-body experience, at least some of these realities, are collective in a way that they are not just individual projections, but they are, at least they seem to be inhabited by groups of people, especially those worlds that are considered the afterlife. Are often described as very nice places that are modeled a bit like the most beautiful places on Earth, and they are inhabited by people that share the same worldview. Several people who have explored the afterlife in out-of-body experiences confirm that there are actually different regions in the afterlife for different belief communities, different religious communities, for example. So it seems like a group of people or a group of individual consciousnesses, shouldn't have a plural, that word, can create a joint reality. And I think that's just what we did in the physical world, except that the collective consciousness that created the physical world is a lot bigger than the one that, for example, creates the heaven of that Christians may experience after they die, for example. I even think that there are lots of variants of Christian heaven and for other religions too, and for non-religious people, for example. But the fact that these realities are so consistent and they can, for example, they can be visited again and again by the same explorer. And also the fact that out-of-body explorers can visit places in the physical world, or at least the non-physical copy of the physical world, which is usually the first layer that is experienced by out-of-body travelers when they hover above their bed and go out the window. It seems to be consistent in a way that they can observe things that happen somewhere else, which they couldn't have known if they hadn't actually been there. So this makes me believe that out-of-body experiences are real in an objective way to such a degree that they are almost as real, or maybe real in the same way as the physical world, even though there are, of course, a lot of subjective projections in those layers too. But that sometimes makes it difficult, especially when you transition from a dream into an OBE or back, can be very confusing according to what I have heard. But there is enough evidence for me that there is a common foundation which exists, like a collective layer of reality that exists outside the physical. And this confirms, together with the fact that these non-physical realities are very sensitive to thought. So the law of attraction works a lot faster there, a lot more direct. According to William Buhlmann, for example, I'm his German translator, by the way. Yeah. There are many layers of reality, and the closer you get to the source of everything, the unstructured global consciousness that contains everything, the less structured the reality you experience becomes. So, and the less structured it is, and the closer you get to the source, the more thought responsive the reality becomes. So, if you're in one of those higher levels where everything is really flexible and moving and everything is flowing energy, you can, with a single thought, you can create great stuff, for example. But on the lower levels, like our physical world, it takes a lot longer. These layers are much more stabilized, which may have a reason. William Buhlmann thinks it's because we are on a training ground here. If everything I think would be created immediately, I could create complete chaos. So, yeah. So this lower level, this basement of reality where we are living is maybe some sort of proving ground where you can start to create something without disrupting everything.
Interesting.
And the higher you go, and you can do that during an OBE, at least to some degree, this experience becomes more apparent, and the fact that our consciousness is creative becomes more apparent. And if you put that all together, then it's that fractal model again that I was talking about.
Yeah. When we apply the idea that kind of everything is happening simultaneously, how does the afterlife apply to that? Because afterlife would be, like me being dead is already taking place, on some level. So the afterlife that I would eventually go to would also be happening right now.
This is one of the hardest questions of all, and I'm not done with it. I can't give you anything definite from my point of view, but from my understanding so far, the non-linearity or the linearity, the apparent linearity of time is something that is equally relative, like the thought sensitivity of reality. The lower you are, the more linear time appears to be. And according to William Buhlmann, for example, a reincarnation is something that just takes place between the lowermost layers of reality. So the lower astral levels, where most of the afterlife environments are located, or maybe all of them, are still very, very structured environments. And from there, people return to the physical countless times usually, and it's a loop. They are in a constant loop, and I think that linear time is perceived on both of these layers. So this creates the appearance of afterlife in a temporal sense. So actually, the individual soul can undergo some sort of evolution by creating this apparent linearity of evolution of itself. So. But I think the higher the level that you visit, the more this linearity of time appears, or this illusion of linearity disappears. Must be something like that. So actually, I think some very high aspect of yourself, your higher self. I think the term higher self is a simplification. I think we have many layers of higher self. Which some people may even perceive as God or something like that, depending on their belief. But I think some very high aspect of yourself would maybe indeed perceive all these lives and all these afterlives simultaneously, where the word simultaneously is actually wrong because it implies time. Yeah. this is the point. So it's really hard to talk about it and to think about it.
Oh yeah.
As I said, I'm not done with it, but I think it's a really complex thing that is multidimensional. There are some interesting stories, for example, by Michael Rhodes in his really recommendable books, where he visits himself earlier in the same life. He takes a non-physical visit to his own past and assists his own former self in its evolution. So that's wicked.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you see that Harry Potter film where Harry travels back in time? And
definitely.
Yeah,
helps himself
and
out.
believes that he first believes it was his father, but actually it turns out it was himself who helped himself. I think this linearity, even on our physical level of reality, this linearity is not so defined as it seems. I think there are many interconnections between our past and future. But for me, the future is not fixed. You always have a choice. There are always different variants of the future, and you can actually decide which one becomes your manifest future. But if you think about everything happening simultaneously, then you must surely include different variants of reality that could happen. So there's that possibility space I was talking about. Because if everything was fixed from the past to the future, then we wouldn't have any choice at all.
Yeah, a lot of your ideas kind of break my brain, to be honest with you. Like
mine too. Not only when I wrote the book, but even now. This last question was the hardest one.
Yeah. Another thing that I'm really interested in, and you kind of answered, is this fractal idea, repeating patterns throughout human existence, as well as like patterns in reality, such as like the known the known view of what, as far as we can see, of what the universe looks like. It's this repeating pattern. It looks very similar to mycelium or human neurons, things like that. And what I'm getting to is that the human brain has this very distinct pattern to it. It has, left, right hemispheres and a center brainstem. Do you perceive the human brain being a representation of consciousness in any way, or is that something that you haven't really paid attention to?
Yes, it's another unsolved question, the exact role of the brain in the entire story. But as far as I believe, the brain is mostly what we perceive it is. It's a physical structure that was mostly created for securing our survival as a physical species. So I don't believe that the brain creates consciousness. I believe that consciousness created the brain, and in this case, a much bigger consciousness than our individual consciousness. So the one that conceived the entire physical world on probably also shaped the idea of the brain, just like anything else in biology. In fact, so primarily for me, it's a survival tool, but secondarily, it's also the tool that shapes the way that we create that we create reality with our consciousness, because our consciousness is very closely linked to our brain. Maybe because our brain is the instance that perceives that processes our senses. But also, I also believe that the brain is some sort of interface between the body and our higher aspects. That's just theory for now, but to me it makes the most sense. It may be even some kind of antenna. As far as I can see, things like thinking and perceiving are not limited to the brain. People who had their brain completely shut down still had near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, and they were able to think and able to feel. But I think that the way how they feel and think is very much shaped by the brain, because that's part of the game. When we incarnate, we are very closely linked to our brains, and it's the center of everything that is linked between our consciousness and the outside world, or what we perceive as the outside world. It plays a huge role in shaping our reality. So it's some sort of filter, some sort of blueprint that we use to create the way of reality that we as humans perceive. Maybe a different animal would perceive the world in a completely different way, or a being without a brain would probably perceive it in just another way.
Fascinating conversation, man, with consciousness today. What are some ways that people can get a hold of you, your work, like your book, The Making of Reality, and also get a hold of you if they want to discuss more?
Okay, so the main problem is that this is my only book that is available in English. So of course, the best way to the English book is available on Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk. You can also get a Kindle version or the ebook version. But the book is shipped from Germany. So far, I did not find a US publisher, unfortunately, or a UK publisher. So I would really love to. So if some publisher is in the audience, please contact me if you're interested. So that would be so great for me. The German edition of the book sold almost 50,000 copies.
Oh wow, that's
so
great.
Far. And this is not so bad for a book that's actually self-published. So
definitely.
Well, the English edition is not going so well because marketing an English book from Germany turned out to be very hard.
Yeah, it's challenging, I'd imagine.
So I would love to have a US publisher, but so far the book can be ordered on starkmuth.com.
Okay.
Could you put that in the text of the podcast? So you can order the hard copy, or you can get the ebook from Amazon.com. And of course, I'm on Facebook. You can contact me in English at any time. So even though most of my Facebook stuff is in German, it's no problem. I'm also on Tail Eaters, of course, on the great Facebook group of Lee. So there are many ways to contact me, and I would be happy to get a greater audience outside Germany. So that would be really great.
Appreciate it, man. And thanks for the shout out for the group. Well, it's been great to talk to you, Jörg, today. And I've learned a lot about consciousness from your book and also our conversation today. It's been very enlightening. So I appreciate you taking the time to spread this message out to our listeners. And hopefully some people will go out and purchase your book and learn more very detailed information in the book.
I hope so. It was my pleasure.
This has been another episode of Cosmic Echo. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about Jörg and his work, you can visit our website at taileaters.com/CE podcast. Additionally, you can support this podcast by clicking on our donation page located at the same website. We look forward to bringing you additional episodes in the near future, but until then, happy dreaming.